I want to address the response that we got on the stadium authorities from the city attorneys first. I thank them for preparing the response. The request for the information was made in early September after access to outside counsel work product procured by the $28,000 taxpayer dollars for the executive branch was denied to city council because of confidentiality that was being afforded to the executive branch. The memo was sent to council on October 29th. I believe that the opening statements of the memo were disrespectful in the demeanor toward providing responses, what I think were reasonable questions. There are statements that allege the questions are based on false premises. And my question is, how do we determine what a false premise is on how this stadium thing is going to be funded if we don't have the final plan? I mean, the whole point of asking the question is what has to be in this language. You can see it directly affects our ability to legislate when we don't know what's possible and what has to be taken into consideration when you're writing or considering charter changes. And this is, it said in general and is discussed more fully below, many of the questions posed by Councilmember Miller concerning stadium authorities appear to be based on the false premise that a stadium authority will have the authority to tax, issue debt, and finance the stadium, and that it will be providing such financing. That wasn't any of my premise. My premise was, can it be done? So the premise was, it's independent of what they plan to do with it. Clearly, none of us know what they plan to do with it. I don't know, maybe Steve does. There is a statement also that I think is pretty hypocritical, and it's inflammatory. It says, it is evident that misinformation has been disseminated by persons lacking familiarity with the details of the C4C project, creating a great deal of confusion regarding the project and the EDC resolution. Well, I'm going to address that. In March of this year, I asked the city attorney about who would have the authority over the various funding sources that were specifically proposed and cited in the City for Champions application. There was an insinuation from Mr. Andrews of a lack of knowledge of funding sources. He stated that I simply didn't understand the application, that any mention of TIFs was strictly related to the state TIF, and, better luck next time. Unfortunately, months before these communications, the mayor's application to the EDC specifically presented to both the city and both city and county TIFs as a funding source for the project, and provided a detailed schedule of how that would be put in place. Mr. Andrews said at that time, acknowledging ignorance of that fact, that is a very different question. It was not addressed or researched in city attorney opinions. Ms. Massey stated, we were not involved in drafting the application and have not yet been asked any questions related to local sales tax TIF. So there's this idea that they know everything, and clearly they've demonstrated they haven't, and then they're insinuating that it's a lack of knowledge of this application. It's not a sin to make mistakes and to not know all the things about which you're asked questions, but then to allege that, I lack familiarity with the details when clearly there's been a demonstrated ignorance on details of the project is distressing. And I'm not going to address each of the responses in the memo, but I will address the very first one. My question was, previously the city attorney was not comfortable with the level of expertise on stadium authorities within the office, President to provide
King,
advice.
I hate to interrupt him, but he is reading or will be reading from a confidential document that we provided to the council, and the council has not waived the privilege on any of those answers. And so I'm just trying to protect for the council that confidential document. If you want Councilmember Miller to continue discussing any answers that were provided, that's perfectly all right, but the council needs to waive the privilege to the document. And I apologize for interrupting.
Okay, so is it okay for Councilmember Miller
Well, I guess council has to decide if and I will restrict my comments if they don't release the privilege.
No, I vote to release the privilege.
Right. So that's 5.
Okay. So.
Same ones, Val. Same ones, we'll remember that. The response begins with the following statement. My question was, previously the city attorney was not comfortable, and this was my question, this had already been released by council at the previous work session. The city attorney was not comfortable with the level of expertise on stadium authorities within the office to provide advice to the executive branch and thus authorized an outside counsel expense of $28,000. Has something changed in the level of expertise in the city attorney's office that the information can now be provided in-house to city council? The response begins with the following statement. The question and characterization of the city attorney's prior statement include inaccurate statements and premises. Let me share with you a statement made by the city attorney in a meeting in July 22nd when asked why there was an allowance for the executive branch to hire outside counsel. And this is a verbatim quote because I wrote it down. It said, "I didn't know jack about stadium authorities." And the mayor said, well, let's just call Craig Umbaugh because he did Denver's. So I didn't want to say that. I asked it, I thought, in what was a very respectful manner. But then I get the question and characterization is inaccurate, and it's not inaccurate. That's what was said. I think it was a reasonable question to ask. So that's what we hear, a disrespectful response, an insinuation that I was somehow misleading folks. That's why I asked the question, because I heard the words, I didn't know jack about stadium authorities. But now we have an opinion that's fully comfortable being sent to city council with the expertise in the office. As for the rest of the 19 questions, and I asked in a public email that's now been published on my website, the city attorney refused to speculate, i.e. refused to answer many of the questions because there's no certainty as how things will unfold and it would be pointless to provide an opinion. Well, from today's discussion, it's not pointless because we need to know what sort of things would be possible. And is it important that we put a limitation on those things that may be possible? Whether it's speculative or not, if it's a charter change, it should cover everything that's speculative in nature. It should be able to say under any circumstances what needs to be covered, what needs to be inserted, what doesn't. I just feel like this is one more piece of evidence that the current state of affairs on legal service provision to this legislative branch, it really does. It tilts the last vestige of checks and balances in this form of government on its back. I don't know what the answer is. There's no will to allow the charter to get outside counsel, but I think that adequate legal services provided to this body are critical in providing the checks and balances that citizens thought they were getting when they voted for this form of government. I don't know, I didn't do a count on the number of questions, but they were all, many of them were, well, it would be speculative. We don't know how it's going to go down. The questions weren't framed, since this is how the city's going to fund this, they were worded as, is it possible to generate a TIF zone for a stadium authority? Has it been done in the past? How would it work? And many of the answers were that would be speculative, and until we have a better idea, it'd be a waste of time to provide this opinion. So I don't feel like the questions were answered, and frankly, I feel like there was a great deal of disrespect in the manner in which they were answered.
Okay, Councilmember Knight.
Ms. Massey's concern about the confidentiality, attorney-client confidentiality, raises a question in my mind that for her, when we get legal opinions in writing and they're confidential, but during our markup session, we got a 20-minute unsolicited dissertation from Mr. Florzak on opinions of what the charter does and does not allow. And there was no mention that is attorney-client privilege. There was no privilege on that. It was just flat out stated in a public forum, opinion we didn't ask for. And why was that not attorney-client when questions and emails from Mr. Miller, or answers to questions and emails from Mr. Miller that went to all council is attorney-client?
Are you asking for an answer?
Yes.
I'd be happy to provide that. All the information that Mr. Florzak gave you was based on the memos that this office had previously prepared for council in a confidential manner in 2002 and 2013, to which the council had previously waived that privilege. He provided no additional information. Ms. Haley was asked questions from council, Council had indicated that they wanted those presented in a public forum, and because that request had come to us in that posture, we assumed that council had waived the privilege to her answers to those specific questions. So we did not see that we were under any attorney-client privilege to not discuss them in an open forum.
I'll disagree with you that there was no new information. Ever since I've been on council, we have been told by Ms. Skinner at least, and I think by an attorney's office, but I cannot verify. My memory is not that good that I'll swear by it, that if we don't approve a budget, then it defaults to the previous year's minus 10%. In his dissertation, Mr. Florzak said, if we don't approve a budget, then the mayor's budget is automatically approved de facto. That was new information and an opinion I had never heard of before in the first time. So when you're saying that is something that was already released in a previous opinion, I have not seen that in any other opinion. And that's just one case of new information that was presented at that time that was not in previous. And I probably could list 5 or 6 more.
I would appreciate it if you did.
I'll go back and read his tape, but that one I know definitely perked up the ears. So just on that alone, counters your opening statement that there was no new information presented.
Okay, so,
If I could just add that, the executive branch, when we were going through the budget and when we saw your slides, we made a request of the attorney's office to be ready to respond to the issue of the 12 versus 5 budget departments. So the request for that response came from me and the mayor's office.
is there any other response besides the one proposal on the outside council that would be satisfactory to any of the 5 that want to do anything about that as opposed to what was presented here or not?
Not that got 5 people interested,
No.
but
If there isn't, okay. I think we're adjourned.